Two Nobel Prize winners once believed they had built a machine so smart it could not lose. A fortress of math, genius, and computing power. For a while, it looked like they had cracked Wall Street's deepest secret: how to make enormous returns with almost no risk. Then, in just 4 months, that genius collapsed. Their hedge fund lost $4.6 billion, shook the world's financial system, and forced the most powerful banks on earth to stage a quiet rescue. This is the story of long-term capital management, and how some of the smartest people in history engineered one of the most spectacular failures ever seen. In the early 1990s, Wall Street looked like an open field for anyone with brains, nerve, and a new way to price risk. Out of this environment came a new kind of fund, long-term capital management, or LTCM. It was founded in 1994 by John Meriwether, a legendary bond trader from Salomon Brothers, a man already famous for making huge bets in fixed-income markets. But what made LTCM truly different wasn't just Meriwether's ambition. It was his team. He recruited some of the most brilliant minds in finance and economics, including two men who had changed the world of financial theory: Robert Merton and Myron Scholes, future Nobel Prize winners in economics for their work on option pricing and risk. To investors, LTCM looked like the Avengers of finance. These weren't just good traders. These were the men whose equations were used everywhere from banks to universities to central banks. Their models promised something intoxicating: the ability to see risk more clearly than anyone else. They believed markets, over time, tended to move toward fair value. When prices deviated from that fair value, they saw opportunity. Their strategy was called convergence arbitrage. It sounded complicated, but the idea was simple: find small mispricings in the bond markets, borrow huge amounts of money, and bet that prices would slowly converge back to normal. Most investors try to make big gains from big moves. LTCM tried to make big gains from tiny moves. That was the secret. They would find two bonds that were almost identical, say government bonds with slightly different maturities or liquidity, and bet that the price difference between them would narrow over time. On each trade, the potential profit was small. But if you borrowed enough money, if you used enough leverage, those small differences could turn into massive returns. And LTCM was willing to use leverage on a scale that stunned even seasoned Wall Street veterans. In its early years, the strategy worked beautifully. Between 1994 and 1997, LTCM delivered eye-watering returns. In some years, it earned more than 40% after fees. Investors were ecstatic. Pension funds, wealthy families, even other banks scrambled to put money into the fund. It was exclusive, secretive, and incredibly profitable. The more successful LTCM became, the more people believed in its invincibility. After all, if two of the world's most brilliant economists said they'd tamed risk with math, who was going to argue? Behind the returns, however, something dangerous was growing. LTCM's positions were enormous compared to its actual capital. For every dollar of investor money, the fund was borrowing dozens of dollars more. At its peak, LTCM had around $4 or $5 billion in capital, but controlled over $100 billion in assets, and had derivative positions with a notional value of more than $1 trillion. That kind of leverage meant that a tiny move in the wrong direction could produce catastrophic losses. But to the models, the odds of a catastrophic move looked impossibly small. The fund was effectively saying, "We are so sure that this will not happen that we are willing to bet the entire house on it." The danger was hidden in the assumptions. LTCM's models were built on historical data. They assumed that markets behaved in patterns, that extreme events were rare, and that diversification across many trades reduced risk. On paper, it looked beautiful. Thousands of positions around the world, each uncorrelated, all converging slowly toward fair value. The math suggested that the odds of losing everything were close to zero. The fund's architects trusted the numbers. They trusted history. They trusted their own brilliance. Then came 1998, and with it, a shock from a place few on Wall Street were watching closely enough: Russia. In August of that year, the Russian government defaulted on its debt. It simply announced that it could not pay what it owed in ruble-denominated bonds. Investors around the world panicked. Suddenly, the assumptions that government debt in a major country was risk-free shattered. If Russia could default, what else was possible? Capital fled to safety. Investors dumped anything that looked even remotely risky and rushed into the safest, most liquid assets they could find. For LTCM, this was the nightmare scenario its models said was almost impossible. The trades it had placed were built on the idea that the spread between safe and risky assets would slowly narrow. Instead, those spreads exploded. The cheap, less liquid securities LTCM had bought became even cheaper. The expensive, highly liquid assets it had sold short became even more expensive. Events that the models described as once in a million years seemed to be happening in real time. The world had stopped behaving like the math said it should. The losses started to pile up at a terrifying speed. In just a few months, LTCM lost $4.6 billion. Positions that once looked like quiet, predictable profit engines turned into bleeding wounds. The fund was trapped. Many of its assets were illiquid, hard to sell quickly without crashing the price further. If LTCM tried to unwind its positions, markets would see the moves, panic, and dump the same assets, making the crash even worse. If the fund did nothing, margin calls from creditors would force it to sell anyway. The irony was brutal. The same intelligence that had attracted capital now amplified the collapse. Because LTCM's founders were seen as the smartest people in finance, other institutions had copied their strategies. Many banks and funds around the world held similar trades. When the Russian crisis hit, it wasn't just LTCM's portfolio that was under pressure. A whole cluster of players, all betting on the same convergence trades, were squeezed at once. What was supposed to be diversification became dangerous concentration. By late 1998, LTCM was on the brink of default. The fund's collapse would not just hurt its own investors. Its counterparties included some of the biggest financial institutions on Earth. If LTCM failed suddenly, it would be forced to liquidate positions everywhere. In government bonds, corporate bonds, interest rate swaps, equity derivatives, emerging markets, and more. Prices could crash across multiple markets at the same time. Those moves would hit other banks' balance sheets, forcing them to sell, triggering a vicious spiral. The risk was not just a failed hedge fund. It was a potential systemic crisis. At this point, the story moved from a hedge fund's bad year to a global emergency. Officials at the U.S. Central Bank understood the danger. They did not want to use taxpayer money to bail out a private fund. But they also knew that letting LTCM implode suddenly could set off a chain reaction no one could control. Behind closed doors, they did something extraordinary. They brought together the heads of the largest Wall Street banks and essentially said, "You built this system. You are all exposed to this fund. Now you have to save it." The result was a highly unusual private rescue. A group of leading banks agreed to inject capital into LTCM in exchange for controlling its positions and slowly unwinding them. They were not doing this out of charity. They were protecting themselves. Many of them had huge exposure to LTCM through loans and derivatives. If the fund died overnight, they would take massive hits. By stepping in collectively, they bought time. The smartest collapse in history would not be allowed to become the dumbest global panic. The two Nobel Prize winners at the heart of LTCM, Robert Merton and Myron Scholes, were not day-to-day traders, but their reputations became inseparable from the disaster. Their theories had helped build the framework that LTCM used. They had shown how to price options and quantify risk under certain assumptions. In academic terms, their work was brilliant and groundbreaking. In the real world, those assumptions met a messy, emotional, political, and unpredictable market. The world did not care what the equation said should happen. The contrast was dramatic. On one side, two of the most celebrated minds in economics, recognized with the highest intellectual honor humanity offers. On the other side, a smoking crater where $4.6 billion had been just months before. It was a brutal reminder that intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. You can understand the math and still underestimate human fear. You can model risk and still underestimate how fast a market can move when everyone runs for the exit at once. What made this collapse so fascinating was not just the money lost but the symbolism. This was supposed to be the age of the quant, the era when computers and formulas outperformed old-school traders who relied on gut feelings. LTCM represented the purest expression of that belief. All brain, no emotion. And yet, when the crisis hit, emotion dominated everything. Investors panicked. Politicians worried. Bankers scrambled. The models said one thing, instinct said another. And instinct won. There is a painful irony in calling this the smartest collapse in history. No one can deny the sheer brainpower inside LTCM. These were not fools. They were not ignorant gamblers. They were, in many ways, victims of their own success. Their early wins made them trusted. That trust allowed them to take on more leverage. The more capital they controlled, the more the market itself started to respond to their presence. They had become so big that their own trades distorted the very prices they studied. The tragedy sits in the gap between what they believed and what reality delivered. They believed diversification made them safe. In normal times it did. But in times of intense stress, correlations that were supposed to be low suddenly shot toward 1. Assets that usually moved independently began to move together. It was like designing a ship that could withstand 100 small waves, only to discover that in a true storm, all those waves combine into a single monstrous wall of water. The LTCM disaster left deep marks on the financial system. Regulators began to worry much more about too interconnected to fail institutions. Banks were reminded that models should inform judgment, not replace it. Risk managers started to talk about tail risk, the small probability high-impact events that can wipe out years of profit in days. The idea that you can safely leverage dozens of times over just because your model says the chances of disaster are tiny suddenly looked absurd. But perhaps the most powerful lesson lies at a human level. Many people watching this story unfold saw something deeply unsettling. If some of the smartest people in the world, armed with cutting-edge math, deep market knowledge, and virtually unlimited computing power, could still blow up this spectacularly, what did that say about the rest of us? It challenged the comforting belief that intelligence guarantees safety. It did not. It never has. For ordinary investors, the LTCM saga is a warning disguised as a story about other people's mistakes. It whispers, beware of anyone who says they've eliminated risk. Be cautious when you hear sentences that start with, this time is different. Be suspicious of strategies that work beautifully in calm weather but have never been tested in a real storm. And be very, very careful when you see huge leverage sitting on top of models that assume the world will act politely. For the Nobel laureates themselves, the experience was a harsh chapter in otherwise extraordinary careers. Their contributions to financial theory remained enormously valuable. Their equations still sit at the heart of modern markets. But the LTCM collapse followed them, a shadow reminding everyone that even brilliant theories need humility in application. It was a living demonstration of a simple but uncomfortable truth. Markets are not just equations. They are made of people, fearful, greedy, hopeful, irrational people. In the end, LTCM did not bring down the global system. It came close enough to scare the people in charge into action. The positions were unwound. Investors took heavy losses. The fund disappeared. Markets moved on. But the ghost of LTCM never really left. Every time another can't lose strategy appears, every time a new generation of quants say the data shows disaster is nearly impossible, someone, somewhere remembers 1998, remembers $4.6 billion vanishing in 4 months, and remembers how quickly, too smart to fail, turned into too fragile to survive. And that is why this collapse still matters. It wasn't just about losing money. It was about losing certainty. It showed that the higher we build our towers of confidence, the more devastating the fall when the ground shifts. It proved that the line between genius and disaster can be razor thin, especially when genius forgets to respect history, emotion, and the sheer unpredictability of the real world. 2 Nobel Prize winners helped design a financial masterpiece. Then the market turned, the models broke, and their creation became a monument to one eternal lesson. Intelligence is powerful, but humility is priceless.